Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you. I hope everyone is well today. On behalf of the leadership of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, I, Dan Mahaffey, the Senior Vice President, am happy to be joined here today with Mareike Ohlberg, who is the author of Hidden Hand, Exposing How the Chinese Communist Party is Reshaping the World. And Mareike is a senior fellow with the Asia program and co-leads the Stockholm China Forum at the German Marshall Fund, and she's joining us from their Berlin office today. So thank you for joining us on this topic. It's a very important one we've looked at within the construct of great power competition and understanding how China and Russia are looking beyond traditional measures of strength to exert their influence, and particularly how China has looked at industry, culture, communications, commerce, and economic power as ways to exert its hard and soft influence in those areas. So Mareike's work is extremely timely, I think, too, and we were chatting earlier and laughing a bit about how it's a year where the NBA and South Park and all sorts of entertainment industry factors fit in to this discussion on China. So without ado, Mareike, please share some of your findings.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, for the kind introduction. Maybe briefly, I am broadcasting to you not from my office, but from my home office. So I am hoping that my internet connection is not going to give out. I live in Berlin, and Berlin and internet is not always compatible. So if I disappear at some point, I apologize in advance. But so far, the connection has been reasonably stable. So yeah, I just want to give a very brief introduction to the topic and what brought me to it, talk a little bit about the principles that the Chinese Communist Party pursues in exerting its influence internationally, and then go a little bit, even though I don't think I have time to go into too much detail, some of the concrete things that it is doing. So first of all, maybe a little bit on my background. I came to this topic because I wrote my PhD thesis on the external propaganda apparatus of the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, back when I was in grad school, started that and finished that in 2013. And at the time, my sense was that even though there was a lot of money being poured into this, this whole external propaganda apparatus and influence apparatus, it wasn't on the whole terribly successful yet. At the time when I left Germany in 2013 to go to the United States first and later to Taiwan. And at that time, my sense was, again, that our conversation on China was so that it was generally critical. If the CCP tried to prevent, for instance, a cultural event from happening, like prevent a movie at a film festival, or try to ban a work of art or a book, or was trying to censor someone, the effect would be the opposite, and that would basically promote that book, that film, that piece of art, that whatever. But when I came back to Germany in 2015, 2016, I found that at least in Europe, our conversation on China, on the Chinese Communist Party, had changed quite fundamentally, in that a lot of the rhetoric that the CCP was putting out, a lot of the initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, were being received quite positively and were being taken quite seriously. And a lot of the talking points that the party wanted to insert into the conversation about how its own model was quite successful were being received a lot differently, at least in Europe, than when I had left Germany. So I come from the European perspective, and usually I talk to European audiences about what Europe needs to do to deal with this. I did look at this from a US perspective as well, but basically just what I'll do here is I'll give you a very brief intro on why it's important to bring the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, back into the picture, and then dip into some of the stuff that's going on in the United States as elsewhere, and maybe finish off by giving some thoughts on what I think needs to happen for us to deal with this. So to start off, Why is it important to bring the party back into the picture? The problem is we talk about Chinese influencing, Chinese interference, and that's not only harmful because it scapegoats a lot of people, just ordinary Chinese people, and makes this seem as something sinister that they're doing, but also because you cannot understand the motives and the strategies of what is happening without looking at the Chinese Communist Party itself. We've basically written the party out of the picture. We talk about President Xi Jinping, whereas in truth, Xi Jinping is not powerful because he's the president of China, but because he's General Secretary of the Communist Party of China. The People's Liberation Army is not a national army, but it is essentially the armed wing of the CCP. It is a party army. Media, we talk about state-owned media, but really media are too important to be owned by the state. They're party-owned, they're party-controlled. And it's kind of interesting. We think of the party-to-party diplomacy and the stuff that the party does as an extension of what the Chinese government does, but really it's more accurate to think of the activities of the Chinese government as an extension of the party internationally. So how are the motivations of what we're seeing tied to the goals of the CCP? Really, what we're seeing is global influence operations done by the CCP are geared towards securing long-term regime security in China and making the world safer for the CCP in the long run. Now, the party will often say when it talks to us, or it talks to Western audiences, that, you know, the United States has developed such a horrible Cold War attitude, and it looks through everything through the lens of Cold War thinking, and that's really outdated. Now the thing is, and I don't want to engage in reverse whataboutism here, but it's really quite ironic because from the point of view of the CCP, the Cold War never really quite ended. And after the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, the party watched the fall of the Soviet Union and basically was very fearful of what would happen next and how it could survive in this new world in which it was quite isolated. So the initial reaction was to consolidate its own power at home, to make sure it had discursive hegemony at home, to make sure it had societal control in its home turf. But over the course of the last 2 decades, I would say, it has really rethought how it wants to handle this new situation it is in, and has switched from a very reactive approach of censorship through the instruments known as the Great Firewall to a more proactive approach. And the basic idea here is that the party has come to the conclusion that you cannot rely on censorship and on a defensive approach for the rest of the party's life. Censorship can only do so much. So what you really need to do is to take the battle beyond China's borders and to make sure that no longer this whole barrage of hostile ideas comes flowing into China, but the party wants to change the conversation at the global level, and it wants to change the balance of power where it feels it's isolated, it is encircled by allies of the United States, basically by the United States-led ally system, and restructure that in a very fundamental way. So this proactive approach that the party has been pursuing has two main aspects. One is to restructure the global alliance system by isolating the United States from its allies. I'll go a little bit into how that is done. And the second part is changing the discourse, the conversation, not only about China, but about anything that the CCP cares about, which is a growing number of topics at the global level. Now, in terms of the methods that the party uses and the approach that the party uses, it's also quite close to how it thinks domestically. And it's the basic what people refer to as the United Front principle. Now, you might have heard about the United Front Work Department, which mainly integrates forces outside the party, brings it into the fold of the party. The United Front principle is a little different. It's the basic idea that, you know, not all people are part of the people. You have the people and the enemies of the people. The enemies of the people are a small minority. But what you have to do, the basic idea of the United Front idea is uniting as many people as possible to isolate the main enemy of the party at a particular point in time and in a particular setting. Now, that main enemy differs depending on whether you look at Hong Kong, whether you look at Taiwan, whether you look at the Tibet situation or Xinjiang. But on a global level, the main enemy is defined as the United States. It used to be the United States with Western Europe as its sidekick. That has changed, and since Donald Trump has come to power, the party has seen an opportunity to really make sure that Western Europe is taken, there's a split between the United States and Western Europe, that the CCP believes it can now split off this Western European sidekick, just like it is able to split off all various other current and former US allies, to isolate the main enemy by making alliances. Now, how does this work? It's basically the way the party has been going about this is by offering, tying countries up, by offering investment, by offering business opportunities, but also through alternative informal alliances. And I don't know how much the Belt and Road Initiative is discussed in the United States, but this would be one example of an informal alliance. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative does a lot of different things. It does export overcapacity from China internationally. It is about investment. But on a geopolitical level, it is really about creating this alternative alliance framework, which it can then use to bring allies of the United States, with Europe kind of as the prize of the Belt and Road, into the Chinese fold by first shifting them into a position where they are invested enough in China that if there is a conflict between China and the United States, those what were formerly clear allies of the United States would first off remain neutral, bring them in that position, and then in the long run, if they're tied up enough with China, they would actually side with China on any issue of conflict. And I think from this perspective, the Belt and Road and a number of other initiatives have progressed quite far, even though in the times of COVID, we've seen some backlash against China, including from Europe. But that's the basic idea, is isolate the main enemy. Now, the same thing, in a way, can be said of what the CCP does in the United States itself. They may look at the United States government as the main enemy, but that doesn't mean that they won't try to connect with Americans on American soil and in other settings, because the same thing applies here. You want to surround your main enemies. One strategy that is known as using the countryside to surround the city, or using the periphery to surround the center, where the center is the center of power and the periphery or the countryside are the allies of that center of power, or forces that can be motivated against it. And in the United States, this is done through a number of informal diplomatic channels, including party-to-party diplomacy, where you don't only liaise with the government that is in power, but through party-to-party diplomacy, you make sure that you're constantly in touch with other politicians and with the opposition party. That is a network that is being maintained through the International Liaison Department of the Chinese Communist Party that regularly meets with politicians from all parties, invites people over to China on visits to kind of see if they can win over future politicians that might enter the stage later, or people that are no longer in power that can then be won over and represent the causes of the CCP vis-a-vis the federal government in the United States. Local diplomacy is another major area, or another major platform for using the countryside to surround the city, where, the CCP, usually via the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, which claims it's an NGO, but it's really a party-led government that is led by party cadres. It's very official. They set up local diplomacy, local networks, sister cities, sister provinces. They work with the National Governors Association, and they really managed to mobilize governors and local politicians against federal policy. That was quite successful in the trade war, where obviously a lot of regions in the United States really did suffer from the trade war. So it was very easy to mobilize governors. But beyond that, the party tries to connect as well. During COVID, there was this one scandal where the CCP had sent a letter to the Michigan Senate, I believe it was, asking them to pass a resolution to praise the Chinese government for its COVID response. And that was kind of that went public, and people were a little concerned and thought, why did this happen? And I wasn't surprised at all. The thing that surprised me was that people were angry enough to make it public, because this kind of connection to the local level happens all the time, and the consulate send out letters all the time, and they put pressure on local politicians. So the only thing that was special about this really was that the Michigan Senate said, no, and not only are we not going to do it, we're going to go public. But it's a very common thing to get local governments to basically express verbal allegiance to the party. It's kind of known as 表态 in Chinese, expressing your verbal allegiance to the party by repeating the phraseology, which is quite common. And a lot of people ask me, so why does China always want us to have language in there against Taiwan or against Hong Kong? And that's it. You're expressing verbal allegiance to the goals of the party. And this language is really important for the party to show that everybody internationally is on the party side, and isolating those people that the party considers splittists or in other ways bad people. So there's a lot going on there in terms of cooperating with national governors. We know that Chinese think tanks have prepared an assessment of all US governors, where they sorted them either as friendly to China, as hostile to China, or as somewhere in the middle. Obviously, the party's going to want to work on the people in the middle that are not yet friendly and want to maintain the friendly folks and isolate the hostile folks. So this is what those assessments are for, just to make sure who do we need to work on more, who has lost territory, and who is firmly in our camp. There are friendship groups. There's the US-China People's Friendship Association, which has, I think, some 35 chapters across the United States, which again, friendship always sounds good, but the problem is that, again, their Chinese partners is, again, the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, a very official party organization that comes in with goals and has actually, even in recent years, become much more active. So those groups are even more closely tied to the official party apparatus. And again, I'm not saying that these clubs shouldn't exist, that there shouldn't be any friendship associations at all, but we need to know, like, people need to be aware of the political nature on the other side, and that it is very much monopolized by the party, and that you're not dealing with civil society in China. And finally, there's a whole barrage in the countryside, using the countryside to surround the city of, I guess, more traditional United Front work groups, which are basically there to organize. United Front is mainly domestically in China, to organize society outside of the party, but it extends internationally. It's an international extension of mass organizations to organize either Chinese people living abroad or people the party claims as Chinese because their ancestors came from China, to try to organize those into those groups that are either based on locality, like their place of origins, like hometown associations, or that are based on people's professions, Students and Scholars Association, I don't know, the Chinese Dentist Association, I'm making this one up, but basically for various professional groups, there are associations, and to link people to the party through those groups. Doesn't mean that everybody wants to be linked to the party, but it is quite dominant in organizing large parts of the overseas Chinese community, and it is very hard for people who don't want to be part of that to have their own communal organization. So that's another large chunk of work the party does. Now, in terms of maybe some of the principles and some of the areas that exist where the party is active, one tactic we all know well, and we've already alluded to it with the NBA, scandal, is killing the chicken to scare the monkey. You usually don't want to pick too many enemies at the same time. So ideally, you want to pick one company, one government, one national government, one politician, punish them symbolically, and then hope that others will get in line. Like, you would pick on one company and then hope that other companies will send out their internal memos to their employees to please not comment on Hong Kong, please not comment on Xinjiang, please not comment on other things. I feel in the corporate sector, it's still working quite well, at least from what I hear, but there has been more backlash against this, with at least the NBA standing up for some time and more companies also growing wary of this. national governments as well. So I don't know for how long this is still going to work that well. But the basic strategy is you don't want to pick too many battles with too many people at the same time, because that would offend too many people at the same time. Again, in the times of COVID, I think the CCP has gone against that principle quite a lot by actually picking battles all over the place. And I'm happy to discuss why I think that is, but that is noteworthy that in those times, they have kind of gone against some of their own principles. Now, just very briefly, maybe to go into two areas before I finish up with conclusions. One is the CCP at university settings, and then I guess the party's media ambitions, what it does in the sphere of media. So in the university setting, I guess we're focusing a lot on Confucius Institutes, and our debate is very much centered on Confucius Institutes, good or bad. Do we need to close them all? How do we handle this? And I do think it's worth having that conversation about Confucius Institutes, and I do think in the long run it's incredibly important that our China knowledge is funded not by the Chinese government and not by the party, but from sources from us. But I do feel that the extensive focus on Confucius Institutes isn't always helpful, and that there are some larger problems that I think universities need to sort out, and that often actually happens outside of the field of Chinese studies, where I don't know, deans of universities or university presidents go into corporations with China rather naively, or it also pays for them to be naive about it. There are a number of joint campuses that are set up in China, which again, in principle, that's a great thing, but in practice, they do have to operate according to Chinese law, and the CCP is increasingly eager to enforce Chinese laws on Chinese soil, fair enough, but we do have to have the conversation, what does that mean for the satellite campuses that are based in China? There is a larger conversation to be had about general research cooperation, to what extent which projects you have that actually feed into PLA research or feed into research that then fuels the domestic surveillance apparatus, the Ministry of Public Security, the Ministry of State Security, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like this conversation is getting started, especially in the US, where I'm sometimes concerned it's going overboard. But the conversation is getting started, but it's still a lot of, at least in Europe, a lot of universities are still very naive about these kinds of cooperations. And it's very hard to get a central system in place to really think about how to handle these corporations. So really, academic cooperation with China, the problems that stem from that go far beyond Confucius Institutes is my main point. And while I do understand that, for instance, universities are very reluctant to cooperate with the FBI, and they don't want to have, a witch hunt on campus where they get the FBI involved, sometimes I wish universities were as hesitant about the Chinese equivalents of the FBI and other intelligence organizations, which they often get in touch with when they do cooperate in China. So just a general awareness thing that needs to be driven forward. In the media, I briefly want to go into the media field, what's been happening there. So since 2009, we've seen an expansion of CCP media that has, seen all the major party state media like Xinhua, like CCTV, like China Radio International, the China Daily expand and especially localize in the different parts of the world by hiring local anchors, local journalists that the Chinese media think will enjoy larger credibility. There is a fairly large issue, I think, of party institutions controlling overseas Chinese media, so that there is, as far as I can tell, a situation where media that publish in Chinese either are complete dissident media, in the opposite direction, or they are very much in line with the party. And what's kind of missing is that middle ground in the middle, what you would normally expect in a healthy media sphere. You only have the dissident media, clear dissident media, and then the ones that are quite aligned with the party state. You have, and this is increasingly being discussed critically, the borrowing boat strategy, where you use foreign media to publish party content, like advertisements, placing editorials by Chinese politicians, publishing op-eds, and some media inserts like China Watch, published by China Daily, that is run by the New York Times and various Wall Street Journal and various other media. But again, I feel like at least in the United States, that is being sufficiently critically discussed at the moment, and this is increasingly drawing attention. We have a whole problem of, China correspondence in China, where the US and China have embarked on this media war, where it's basically each side one-upping the other by kicking out more correspondents and more media people from the other side. So in that regard, the US media presence in China is being diminished quite substantially. It's slightly different for Europe, where I think some of the correspondents can still be pressured through threats to their visas. But overall, I feel in the media sphere, especially people who work directly with or in China, there's a fairly high alertness on the part of journalists of the party state that they're dealing with. So it's more about how do you handle that with media that don't regularly deal with China. There, I see a lot more issues. Germany has this media dialogue with China, where then German media professionals are invited to participate in this dialogue. The party puts on a show of giving its party line, and then a lot of the media representatives that don't work frequently on China will say, oh, great, now I have sources in China that I can tap for our article. So again, it's more like getting the people on board that don't directly deal with China all the time. So what needs to happen to arrive at a better China strategy? And this is, the things I would say in Europe would be quite different from what I will now say to a US audience. So my basic problem is, I think a lot of the stuff that the Trump administration has been doing are not wrong. I think some of them overshoot the mark, and some of them I think are bad for healthy civil society. Some of them really overshoot the mark. Others I think are really good, but the problem really is getting a consistent long-term strategy that I know is not just done to possibly achieve some other purpose, like getting reelected, like in the past getting concessions for the trade war. So how can we rely on this to be permanent and long-term? And that's really the challenge here. How do we get that in the long run, and how can we get more allies to actually get on board with this, with perhaps some slightly less drastic measures, but therefore something that also other countries would be willing to replicate? That is one major area where we have to work on. I think the other thing that is important is to get a general understanding on all sides. That's very difficult to get the CCP to do something it doesn't want to do. So you can't change what the party wants to do unless it sees a benefit in that. You can throw tariffs at China and do all this that the Trump administration has been doing, but in the end, you're going to end up with an overrated purchase order that probably isn't even going to be honored. So that really should serve as a reminder to everybody that it's hard to get the party to do something it doesn't want to do. So you have to work with the way it is and see that you can protect your own institutions from being taken over to serve the party's purposes. I think it is incredibly important to get civil society on board with this, to invest in China literacy at home, again, home funded not by China or the Chinese government or other Chinese sources, but really increase China literacy, because a lot of the stuff that I see from people that don't deal with China directly really comes from not understanding the party that we're dealing with. Understanding the divide and conquer strategy that the CCP has been using and countering it more actively by working more constructively with allies. Understanding also the party links of the Chinese partners that organizations in the United States are dealing with, like the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries. Just this is, again, increasing China literacy so that people know who they're dealing with. Not saying no one can deal with them at all, but at least do it knowingly. Creating codes of conduct for engaging with Chinese partners, like how much can we still do and where are our red lines, and those really need to be defined in various professions, at the university level, at the media level. I know it's very difficult to create it at company level, but even that would have to happen. Increased transparency. I mean, the United States already has some mandatory lobby registers, which other countries don't have, but also at the civil society level. For instance, if there's a memorandum of understanding, it should be made public by default, so that we have a better understanding of what's happening. Mapping out influence networks and mechanisms, and also consider establishing an incident tracker for actual repressive incidents of intimidation and censorship or self-censorship, because again, a large part of the problem is that a lot of the more repressive stuff happens behind the scenes and people rarely go public. So I only learn about them when I speak with people person to person. So create something that we get a fuller picture of what is actually going on, so we can better understand and better counter it. I'm going to close with this, and I really look forward to the discussion with everybody. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you, and for those of you listening along, please don't hesitate to put your questions in the Q&A function if you would like to do that. We're already starting to get some in here. One of the first ones I'll take, and it's one I have, but I also see from the audience, how do we best distinguish between those efforts of China and those that you see that any country does in terms of public diplomacy, outreach, pairing? What is that line that makes it more insidious than the efforts that perhaps any other country would go about?
So I think there's usually two things that I name, and I don't fully distinguish between the two. I mean, there's some people who say we have to very clearly distinguish between the two. I do think some of the stuff that China does, other countries do as well. And to some extent that also, I think some of the stuff that the Chinese government does are, I think in theory, legitimate. And I'm not looking to shut everything down that is happening. I do see two things, or maybe three. First, even if something is completely legitimate, it may not be in our interest. That is one thing. And I'm not value neutral. Like, I do distinguish what the purpose is of someone doing this. And if the purpose is to spread more authoritarian norms, I do see that different than what other governments are doing that are looking to advance some of the national interests. But basically the Chinese government's standing up for its interests. I get that. There are two things I would point to. The first one is, it is done quite more systematically by the CCP. If you look at, I don't know, city relationships, sister city arrangements, one thing that the Chinese side is often astonished by is that on the Western side, there's like in the international department, there's maybe like one or two people who are responsible for these relationships. And that's really quite stunning to some of the Chinese partners who are used to having a liaison department. And again, I'm not saying it's perfectly organized, but it is a lot more systematic. So one thing really is the systematic nature of it, to make sure you really get as many people as possible and you have a lot more organizational power behind that. Then there's also the question to what extent you can argue it's legitimate for the CCP to work with national governors to kind of work against the federal government. But again, if we did that in China, I think the CCP would take issue with that. If we worked systematically with provincial governments to work against the national government's goal, I think the CCP would also point that out as problematic and would try to shut that down. So even in the area where you could arguably say it counts as legitimate, we would have a reciprocity issue if we tried that in China. The other thing that I see increasingly, and that wasn't always the case, but is now becoming increasingly the norm, is the willingness to exert pressure behind the scenes. And by that, I'm not saying that the United States or other governments never do that, but it has kind of, at least from where I stand, the CCP has exerted to pressure behind the scenes on a lot of issues, including some very small issues, such as what individual people say on the social media feed, or what individual employees of companies say on the social media feed, or what individual cities say or do when they praise China's COVID response. So the willingness to exert pressure behind the scenes has simply gone up quite significantly. And this is where the area where this goes into the illegitimate. And the problem, again, distinguishing between the legitimate and the illegitimate is usually, unless I know about all the channels that exist and have good context to everyone, I'll hardly ever find out about the efforts to exert pressure unless something gets leaked or unless I talk to someone, which is usually why I say even the stuff that I consider legitimate, I still want to map it because I want to get an overview of where all those channels are through which pressure can be exerted.
I think it was interesting in the way you described it of reciprocity. You know, the idea that if a similar action were taken in Hubei province, if we wanted to create a Hamilton Institute at a university there, what would happen of that nature? But what are we willing, in your findings, in your study, in your research, has it simply been the bottom line? Has it been worth it to not have that kind of reciprocity? Has the profit for the corporate engagement, the trade, does that drive the groups, the interests, the special interests, the lobbying to go along and get along with this?
So I think money, or the perception of being able to make money, and oftentimes it's really the perception, has driven a lot of this. There's a lot of party outreach, but if people were not convinced they could get some money out of the Chinese market, I think a lot of this would collapse. It would not be able to like the mere party outreach on its own, if there was no money or no chance of making money behind it, would not succeed. So it is tied to the opportunities that arise from the Chinese market. But, and this is an argument I make quite frequently, especially in Europe, a lot of this is perception. Take Germany. Germany is probably the most exposed to the Chinese market of all the European countries. Even the German dependence on the Chinese market is not that high. And if you look at it, you will find it is driven by a few key industries like automotive, like some chemical industries that are heavily reliant on the Chinese market, that are politically overrepresented and that drive this. In the United States, you would also find, I think, the ones that are left in the United States that see a chance in the Chinese market are probably financial, like Wall Street. That is, I think, in other sectors, there's been a lot of rethinking in the United States, but it's usually driven by a few key industries that are fairly influential. But even there, a lot of this, it's not like China doesn't benefit from their presence on the Chinese market. So I think a lot of this really is psychological. So it's a mixture of this hope of gaining from the Chinese market, plus the fear that anything you do could risk that access, without thinking that, you know, in the long run, the Chinese government would also hurt itself if it were to cut that off. Like if it were to cut German automotive out of the Chinese market, that generates a lot of employment in China. So I think even these companies and the governments where these companies are based, they have a lot more leverage than they think they do, but then they are also driven by fear. And therefore actually take themselves back and censor themselves a lot more than would realistically be necessary. But the problem is, you know, I tell them that, and then they're like, yeah, but what in the off chance that you're wrong, or that in this particular case, they retaliate against us. So it's this, that's what policy is driven by to a large extent, in my opinion. So it's not, money is important, but so is perception and fear.
First of all, just as a technical note to those joining us, Ambassador Pickering sends his regrets. He's having technical difficulties connecting, so he sends his apologies, and to the audience as well. I just wanted to pass that along. But another question I have for you as we continue this discussion. when you hear how the party uses Chinese culture, or you hear phrases such as, this hurts the feelings of the Chinese people, and the way that the party has adopted a role to itself as the arbiter and protector of what is Chinese culture, and how that fits into how we engage with China, but also criticism that comes that any criticism of the party is somehow racially or ethnic. How do you see those trends developing in your work?
Yeah, I mean, that's like the party presenting itself as the single arbiter of all things Chinese and of what is Chinese culture, what are Chinese feelings. That's been the case for a long time, and it's one of the things that's important to push back against, and I think there's plenty of reason to push back against it. It's not, I mean, I think it's a little more complicated than to say, okay, here is the CCP and here are the Chinese people and those are totally distinct. It is the ruling party of China. It has 90 million members. It has a bunch of people in China that feel either support the party or supported in part of it. So it's not a super clear-cut distinction. So I'm not someone who will say, I hate the Chinese Communist Party, but I love the Chinese people. One, there are many Chinese people I don't know and have absolutely no feelings about. But I do think it's a little more complicated, but it's still incredibly important to challenge the party narrative that they are the single arbiter of what is Chinese. And to some extent that is happening, and is happening quite successfully, and it's happening, a lot of that is actually done by some people who are Chinese or who are of Chinese heritage. In other cases, it's increasingly becoming mainstream to distinguish between the two. And even though I don't see those two as fully separate, I do think there are some ties. I think that's a positive development to distinguish between the two, because if I have to decide either between a clear distinction or taking up the party narrative, I prefer the clear distinction, even though it's problematic in its own ways. So I feel like on that front, there's actually been some encouraging pushback, and we're on the right track with regard to that, with all the complexities that are inherent in the relationship between the party and China as a whole. But overall, I'm fairly optimistic on that.
In terms of how we approach this in the West, one of the questions we have from the audience is, do we best consider this a counterintelligence threat or a diplomatic challenge?
I think that question kind of sums up some of the issues that exist, in that it doesn't fall into a clear-cut category, that the way it's organized through the party and with the goals of the party and with the categories of how the party distinguishes between different groups and how it handles them. There's really no real equivalent that we have. So it's not a purely diplomatic challenge, because a lot of this, again, it's done at the party level, so diplomacy doesn't even apply. And again, a lot of the channels that are being used by the party would not fall under traditional diplomacy. Like you wouldn't have the United States government try to organize the American community in Berlin in any way, shape, or form that the Chinese embassy here tries to reach out or tries to surveil the dissident community that is based in Berlin. So that's really, that really is the challenge, that it doesn't fall into one clear-cut category, and that a lot of different sectors, diplomacy, counterintelligence, academia, media, business, are affected by a lot of the same problems, but they need to kind of figure it all out by themselves, because there's not that much, media and university might still talk, but usually all of these sectors and all of these professional groups kind of have to come up with similar solutions, even though they're disjointed from one another. And that really is the challenge to me, of how to deal with that, how individual individual professions, individual sectors can come up with their own codes of conduct that will share something in common with the stuff that others come up with, but that link up usually doesn't happen. And that's because, again, it doesn't fit into one neat category.
Have we found any evidence of successful measures where public anger about towing the Beijing line or perceptions, we've heard now companies that perhaps are using Uyghur labor to make clothing. Are there any examples of public outrage in the US and Europe about those that have proven to change corporate behavior re-China, or is it just simply on to the next news cycle?
So, I mean, I think the NBA scandal was kind of the biggest outrage that I've seen in the United States on this so far, because, it affected basketball and everybody suddenly felt involved in this, and it kind of gained this mainstream acceptance, and people who had nothing to do with China all of a sudden had very strong opinions on Hong Kong or on other rights issues that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten in contact with. And the NBA initially caved to that. I feel like in the long run, it's still, got its hopes pinned on the Chinese market and is willing to adjust its behavior accordingly. But at least for a moment, there was a change. I do think that with regard to Xinjiang, we have some momentum going of legal measures, including the most recent sanctions from the United States against, the Bingtuan, the what's it called in English? The basically the paramilitary force that is based in Xinjiang that kind of runs that runs a significant section of society and some of the farms and is behind some of the cotton production, etc. So sanctioning those is going to have an effect. And companies are going to look at their supply chains and are going to, I'm fairly confident, make adjustments. And I do think that similar things were already underway in Europe. So there are some legal measures that are forcing companies to do this. And in many ways, I would argue it's important that government do this because you can't expect companies to do this on their own without regulations. And there are actually some examples where if companies can say, look, we have to do this because it's a government requirement, it's going to be a lot more accepted than if they act on their own. So I think in the everything concerning Xinjiang, even though a lot more needs to be done, again, I do think we've seen some measures that have been taken that are likely, in my estimation, going to have quite broad consequences and how companies are going to have to reassess their supply chains, and that's good.
We have some questions about BRI in the queue here, and with first I would say that one of the themes here is what's the advantage to these small countries? What do they see as the benefit? And if it is for these smaller countries kind of a classic small state dependency, are there better forms of proactive responses, programs of our own, offshore balancing? How do we address that?
So what are the benefits for small countries? Well, first off, I think some of the benefits that they're hoping for in terms of investments, some of that is not going to manifest. I don't think everything that's been promised is actually going to result in investments. So again, I do think part of this is psychological of those small countries, similar to companies, pinning their hopes on Chinese investment coming in, which some of it may not actually manifest in the end. In some other cases, I do think there are concrete benefits for at least some people in those countries, and that I guess some of the funding that they get for some projects, those projects otherwise wouldn't be viable, so nobody else would be willing to fund it. Now, of course, you can discuss the wisdom of having those funded if they're not actually viable, right? But again, some people in those countries do benefit, even though certainly not all people, but maybe some of the people who call the shots. It is in a way, I guess, especially in the European periphery, it can be used by those countries to put pressure on the EU and say, look, if you don't fund this, then the Chinese are going to fund this. That essentially makes it, and I'm not an expert on the BRI, so take whatever I say with a grain of salt, but that makes it difficult to address, because you can't say, well, we're going to fund everything that China was going to fund, because then you might end up with a bunch of projects that aren't actually economically viable. But I do think it's also overly easy for, say, the large European countries to just point blame at smaller countries in Europe and say you're the problem because you're taking all this Chinese money and you're going through all these back channels with Chinese diplomats, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a difficult balance of offering some money and some funds. And again, EU funding in a lot of European countries inside and outside the EU outside is a lot larger than Chinese funding. So again, a lot of this really is used as pressure. So continuing to fund some of the stuff that is worth funding, and on the stuff where it's not, I don't know, call countries out on it. I don't have the perfect solution here. It's, I guess if I could solve this, I would have a hopefully much higher paid job in Brussels.
I'll hope for higher paid jobs solving this in some place. But the question too, and I think as we move forward on this subject, and you talk about this influence, the mixture of what it was of changing decision making here in the US or in European capitals, as well as the balance of how much of it is also control of what information comes back into China. And is there a prioritization of those twin goals to, again, influence decision making versus information flows and perception?
So I have usually argued, and some people disagree with me, but this is my take on it. I think the domestic component has always been more important for the party. And a large part really has been about, yes, about getting decisions from foreign governments that are in China's favor, but also being able to show that. And sometimes if you're able to create the perception that they are in China's favor, that's enough. So that's always been the case. Of course, again, the idea is also to actually help flank China's foreign policy, to help it achieve its international goals. So that's not the only goal, but that feeding back home has always been important. In a way, I think some of what we've seen in the COVID times is what I would describe as the great turn inward, where this domestic focus really is now of outsized importance. Whereas before it was like, you know, if we can have some success abroad and can showcase to Chinese people that we're respected abroad, that is ideal. Now, as long as success or the perception of success can be demonstrated towards the domestic audience, it's also okay to offend a lot more international partners. So that's kind of why I guess we've seen also this change in how the party picks a lot more conflicts with a lot of different countries at the same time, something which it would have been a lot more cautious not to do previously. Because again, you don't want to have too many open conflicts, ideally, in a situation where you can afford not to. You want to, you know, pick a fight with one symbolic country to get everyone else to fall in line. If you pick too many conflicts with too many countries at the same time, they may link up and find out that they have the same experiences, and that's going to, you know, have consequences for the Chinese government. But under the current circumstances, where this what I really see as the great turn inward, as economic legitimacy is in danger, and you need to go for other sources, such as sometimes knee-jerk nationalism, that is becoming increasingly like picking fights with many countries at the same time is simply prioritized, because if before the domestic audience was maybe 70%, now it's 95%, to put in simplified terms. And that's really one of the changes we've seen in the COVID times.
So the wolf warrior is very much a domestically oriented audience gambit in their diplomacy, would be yours.
pretty much. I mean, I think strategic wolf warriordom was accepted and possibly was encouraged before. Like even for years before COVID, we've seen wolf warriors in Sweden, where the Chinese ambassador to Sweden would scream at the Swedes and would, you know, be a big wolf warrior. But this was more an experiment. I see as like experiment, see if that works on other European countries. And I think to an extent it did. It worked to some extent on the Swedish government, it worked to some extent on other countries, but it stops working once too many countries have that exact same experience and can, you know, then link up and say, oh, we don't have the problem, China has a problem, and we need to figure out how to deal with that, right? So that's what's new, this taking overhand and seeing this in so many different settings at the same time.
I think, and I look at the clock here, we're down to our final several minutes here, but one question we have here is, and as you said from our audience, but you said that the Cold War never really ended for the CCP. And that as we move ahead in this era, what do you see, and this question asks about the optimum relationship, which could probably be a whole nother seminar in itself, but at least in this influence and struggle for ideologies and debate, what do you think is the best way for democracies to approach this authoritarian challenge?
So first off, I mean, I've already said in various sectors that deal with Chinese partners, which are increasingly going to be party people or people who are under heavy influence on the party, have your own codes of conduct. What are we willing to do? What do we gain from doing that? So I guess on the civil societal level, stop engagement for engagement's sake. Engagement, I'm not saying everything has to stop, and I do think it's important that some channels remain open, but it needs to be more strategic, and it has to be more than just internationalization is our strategy, so we pursue this blindly at whatever cost. No, be more strategic about it, define your own goal, what do you hope to get out of it? What are your risks? What could be the demands from the Chinese side? And where do you draw the line? This far, not further. And in many ways, that strategy that I would hope to see at the civil society level, I would also hope to see at the government level in various governments. Other than, of course, ideally, the United States working with its allies more. But at every level, the idea has to be, okay, what do we want from the Chinese Communist Party? Where are the few, we often talk about shared interests. So where are they actually? Where are the actual shared interests? So not just the CCP saying this is in our interest and the CCP is a champion for multilateralism, but what are they really interested in? What do they benefit from? Then think, do we benefit from that? And those are the areas where you can pursue cooperation, where you can pursue joint initiatives on certain very limited topics, and do that. But don't hold yourself back in other areas because you're scared of endangering those projects. Because if the CCP is actually interested in it, it'll do it. If it's not interested in that cooperation, you can stand on your head and dance and sing and do whatever you want. You're not gonna get it. So stop pursuing unrealistic goals of trying to get changes in China. For instance, I mean, the United States is trying to do it. Europe is trying to do it to force China to change its economic system at home, to reform its SOE sector. It's not gonna happen. Don't try to do that. And don't hold yourself back in other areas because you fear, like on human rights criticism, on Hong Kong, on any other area, because you feel your criticism could endanger your great goal of getting the CCP to reform its economy. They don't wanna do it. It's not gonna happen. Look for the few areas where there is common ground, work on those, on everything else, stick to your own interests. That's what needs to happen. Ideally in a concerted effort. And that's, of course, almost my list to Santa Claus for Christmas, right? But I do think some of this is possible. And I do think that some of this realization is happening at the political level. It just needs to go further, and it needs to be more strategic, more long-term, and more principled. This is what needs to happen.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. Mareike, thank you for participating in this conversation. We really enjoyed it. It is so timely, topical, informative, and what we need to know in this very important discussion about the influence our corporations, our local governments, local leaders, academic leaders all face. So thank you for joining us. Thank you everyone for being here, and everyone stay well.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.